4.9 million. That's the number of adults in New South Wales who put their hand up and volunteered in 2020. Volunteers gave an average of 25 hours per month. That's a total of 1.5 billion hours given in 2020 alone. This volunteering is worth an estimated $127 billion in value to our state. These are amazing numbers highlighting the generosity of New South Wales residents. But what does this look like day to day? How do volunteers volunteer? Let's explore how volunteering happens on the ground. In New South Wales, 59.5% of people volunteered both formally through a volunteer involving organisation, such as a not-for-profit, private or government organisation, and informally themselves in their local community without organisational support. So who volunteers within these organisations? Organisations rely on a broad range of volunteers. 80% of volunteer involving organisations relied on volunteers aged 65 and over, and almost half included skilled professionals in their volunteer ranks. We know that 2020 brought with it a range of challenges for organisations, communities and individuals. Volunteer involving organisations were certainly not immune. Organisations reported a change in who volunteered with them. The greatest change was that there were fewer older volunteers or volunteers with underlying health issues. Fortunately, organisations reported an increase in the number of working age and young volunteers. A reliance on an ageing volunteer workforce and underrepresentation of some groups provides a risk for organisations. A diverse volunteer workforce is required to minimise the impact of future trends and challenges such as COVID-19. Let's explore how volunteers are recruited. Volunteer involving organisations facilitate volunteering by recruiting, organising and deploying volunteers. The most common recruitment method used is word of mouth. This is followed by social media and organisations' websites. Organisations also use open days and events and traditional forms of media, such as newsletters and posters, to engage with potential volunteers. Recruiting through word of mouth highlights how the excitement and passion of existing volunteers can attract and bring new volunteers in. There is a challenge here though for volunteer organisations. Relying on recruitment within existing networks, such as their volunteers networks through word of mouth, limits the reach of the organisation and the number of potential volunteers. Recruiting within networks can also be a barrier to inclusion and diversity, as peer-to-peer recruitment may result in a bias towards people that look like me. For volunteer organisations to attract diverse volunteers with the range of skills needed in an ever-changing world, they may need to utilise a greater mix of recruitment methods. How do organisations recognise and thank volunteers for the amazing time and effort given and inspire them to keep going? Findings show they use a range of methods to motivate and retain their volunteers. Organisations work hard to facilitate personal connections and relationship building for their volunteers. Encouraging these connections and relationships is both a way for organisations to engage and retain volunteers, and also the natural outcome of people coming together for the common good. Other popular methods used by organisations to help build the social engagement include out-of-hours gatherings, events and celebrations. Organisations also employ the use of awards, such as certificates or letters of appreciation, to motivate and retain their volunteers by recognising their efforts, time and dedication. Organisations recognise that the reimbursement of expenses plays a role in motivating and retaining volunteers. Volunteering is not free. Costs faced by volunteers themselves include such things as transport and travel expenses, food and drink, phone, internet and communications. We found that volunteers spend on average more than $1,900 a year of their own money on volunteering. This equates to volunteers in New South Wales paying $5.56 per hour to volunteer. With only 36% of organisations reimbursing some or all of their volunteers' expenses, this cost to volunteers is an important issue. Organisations need to be careful not to exclude people who would be willing to volunteer or volunteer more, but cannot afford the out-of-pocket costs. What are the challenges facing our volunteer-involving organisations? With volunteer-involving organisations facilitating the majority of volunteering, issues being experienced by organisations are important to address. The main issues for organisations relating to volunteers were volunteer health and safety and volunteer retention. These results are not surprising, given the impact of COVID across the survey period. Organisations also identified financial viability and sustainability as a growing concern. $2 billion was spent by volunteer-involving organisations in 2020 to enable volunteering. The main costs faced by them are insurances, followed by wages and salaries for volunteer managers. We asked volunteer-involving organisations what support they felt was most needed to enable their activities. Supported organisations are vital to the successful management of rewarding, productive volunteer programs. The top 4 support needs identified were volunteer management, access to funding, grants or sponsorship, volunteer recruitment, and volunteer appreciation and recognition inside the volunteer organisations themselves. While this is not an exhaustive list, the areas of support needed match the challenges organisations have identified. To understand the needs of volunteer-involving organisations further, we looked at the trends in volunteering during 2020 compared to the last 3 years. What changes are organisations seeing on the ground with their volunteers? Trends included the increased amount of training volunteers need to be able to carry out their roles, the increased desire of volunteers to be able to volunteer online or from home, and an increased need for volunteer flexibility, such as volunteers wanting to volunteer occasionally rather than on regular or fixed hours. The trend in increased training requirements and demand from volunteers for more flexibility requires strong contemporary volunteer management. We asked volunteer-involving organisations to predict the future by asking them, in 3 years' time, are people more or less likely to be volunteering with your organisation? Around 1/3 said they expected the same level of volunteering in 3 years, and more than 1/3 thought there will be more, or a lot more, people volunteering. This is an incredibly positive outlook. Organisations see a bright future ahead in regard to how many people will be giving their time with them. Volunteers across New South Wales are vital to the health and well-being of our communities and state. They are involved with nearly every aspect of our society and culture, such as the environment, health, emergency services, community services and sport. The nature of volunteering and our communities is constantly changing. The importance of volunteer-involving organisations to navigate this change and to guide and support our volunteers into the future could not be greater. To find out more about the state of volunteering in New South Wales and the organisations we rely upon to facilitate and support volunteering, dive deeper into the findings at www.volunteering.com.au/SOVR.